Hi, we are going to be working on section 2, scientific inquiry. All right, so if you want to do the discovery activity at home, you can. Um, Basically, you're going to take 2 eggs and you can use 2 cups and fill them with water. Put 1 egg in each beaker, observe what happens. So 1 egg should actually be a boiled egg and 1 egg should be a raw egg, and kind of see what happens with both of those. All right, so let's get into scientific inquiry. We're going to be looking at what is scientific inquiry and what makes a hypothesis testable, and how do scientific theories differ from scientific law. Okay, so let's continue on with our reading here. Chirp, chirp, chirp. It is one of the hottest nights of summer, and your bedroom windows are open, wide open. On most nights, the quiet chirping of crickets gently lulls you to sleep, but not tonight. The noise from the crickets is almost deafening. Chirp, 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 chirp. Why do all the crickets in your neighborhood seem determined to keep you awake tonight? Could the crickets be chirping more because of the heat? How could you find out? As you lie awake, you are probably not thinking much about science, but in fact, you are thinking just like a scientist would. You made observations, you heard the loud chirping of the crickets, and felt the heat of the summer night. Your observations led you to infer that heat might cause increased chirping. You might even make a prediction. If it's cooler tomorrow night, the crickets will be quieter and I can sleep. Although you may not know it, your thinking and questioning is the start of the scientific inquiry process. Scientific inquiry refers to the diverse ways in which scientists study the natural world and propose explanations based on the evidence they gather. If you have ever tried to figure out why your CD player has stopped working, then you have used scientific inquiry. Similarly, you could use scientific inquiry to find out whether there is a relationship between the air temperature and the crickets chirping. Okay. Scientific. So, what is the scientific inquiry? So, the scientific inquiry is a process that includes the different ways that scientists find out about the natural world. So, this is what we're going to be talking about today, okay? So, the first thing we're going to do is pose a question. Scientific inquiry often begins with a problem or question about an observation. In the case of the crickets, your question might be, does the air temperature affect the chirping of crickets? Of course, questions don't just come to you from nowhere. Instead, questions come from experiences that you have had from observations and inferences that you make. Curiosity plays a large role as well. Think of a time that you observed something unusual or unexpected. Chances are good that your curiosity sparked a number of questions. Some questions cannot be investigated by scientific inquiry. Think about the differences between these two questions. Why has my CD player stopped working? What kind of music should I listen to on my CD player? The first question is a scientific question because it can be answered by making observations and gathering evidence. For example, you could change the batteries in your CD player and observe whether it begins to work. In contrast, the second question has to do with personal opinions or values. Scientific inquiry cannot answer questions about personal taste or judgments. Okay, so here's our reading check. What role does curiosity play in posing questions? I'm going to give you a minute to think about that. So you should have had some time to talk about or think about what role does curiosity play in posing questions. So your curiosity allows you to use your observations and make questions from that because you're curious about how things work and how they are fixed. Okay? All right. So, posing questions. Scientific inquiry often begins with a problem or question. Questions often arise from experiences or observations. The temperature is really warm tonight. I wonder if the air temperature affects the chirping of crickets. All right, so after we have a question, we develop a hypothesis. How could you explain your observation of noisy crickets on that summer night? Perhaps crickets chirp more when the temperature is higher. You think, in trying to answer the question, you are in fact developing a hypothesis. A hypothesis or hypotheses is a possible explanation for a set of observations or answers to a scientific question. In this case, your hypothesis would be that cricket chirping increases at higher temperatures. It is important to realize that a hypothesis is not a fact. Instead, it is only one possible way to explain a group of observations. In this case of the crickets, perhaps they only sounded louder that night because you had left more windows open than you usually do, or maybe there were more crickets around that night. In science, a hypothesis must be testable. This means that researchers must be able to carry out investigations and gather evidence that will either support or disprove the hypothesis. Many trials will be needed before a hypothesis can be accepted as true. All right, I'm going to give you a minute to think about what is a hypothesis. All right, you should have said that a hypothesis is a set of observations or answers to a scientific question. Okay? So let's go back and talk about these things. Okay? Okay, so if a local biologist observes one summer that a certain species of bird, once common in your area, no longer can be found. Given this observation, what scientific questions do you think the biologist would ask to begin a scientific inquiry? I'm going to give you a minute to think about that. You can push pause if you need more time. Okay? So you might think, why has the bird disappeared from the area? Has a disease wiped it out? Has the environment changed in some way? So you're starting to think and make observations of what could have happened. From those observations, you can then design a hypothesis. Okay, next after we have a question, then we have a hypothesis, and now we're going to design the experiment. After you state your hypothesis, you are ready to design an experiment to test it. You know that your experiment will involve counting how many times crickets chirp when the air temperature is high, but how will you know how many times the crickets would chirp at lower temperatures? You would need to include other crickets in your experiment for comparison. So we're going to have control variables when we're designing our experiment. To test your hypothesis, then you will need to observe crickets at different air temperatures. All other variables or factors that can change an experiment must be exactly the same. Other variables include the kind of crickets, the type of containers you test them in, and the type of thermometer. By keeping all these variables the same, you will know that any difference in cricket chirping must be due to temperature alone. The one variable that is purposely changed to test a hypothesis is called the manipulated variable. It is also called the independent variable. In your cricket experiment, the manipulated variable is the air temperature. The factor that may change in response to the manipulated variable is called the responding variable, or also called the dependent variable. The responding variable here is the number of cricket chirps. Okay? We set up the containers to be identical except for the temperature conditions. Now we have to agree on how to time and count the chirps. Okay? So we've changed the temperature. You can see here in the picture, there's 15 degrees C and 20 degrees C. Okay. I want to talk about what are variables. Okay, variables are something that can change in an experiment. What is the manipulated variable? That's the variable that changes on purpose during an experiment. That's the one that you are changing. The responding variable is the variable that changes in response to the changes that were made by the manipulated variable. A controlled experiment means that everything else stays the same except the variable that you are manipulating. Okay? This is important for you to understand what the definitions of a manipulated and a responding variable are. Okay? Setting up a controlled experiment. An experiment in which only one variable is manipulated at a time is called a controlled experiment. Figure 9 shows one way to set up a controlled experiment to test your cricket hypothesis. Notice that identical containers, thermometers, leads, and crickets are used in each setup. In one container, the temperature will be maintained at 15 degrees C. In the other two containers, the temperatures will be kept at 20 degrees C and 25 degrees C. The importance of control variables. Suppose you decide to test the crickets at 15 degrees C in the morning and the crickets at 20 degrees C and 25 degrees C in the afternoon. Is this a controlled experiment? The answer is no. Your experiment would have two variables, temperature and time of day. Would increase chirping due to the temperature difference, or are the crickets more active at certain times of day? There would be no way to know which variable explains your results. So it is very important when we're designing our experiments, right? Okay, forming operational definitions. One of the other aspects of a well-designed experiment is having clear operational definitions. An operational definition is a statement that describes how to measure a particular variable or define a particular term. For example, in this experiment, you would need to determine what sounds will count as a single chirp. All right, we're going to do our reading checkpoint. I want you to take a minute. What is a manipulated variable? You can pause the screen if you need more time. A manipulated variable is the variable that we are changing in the experiment. Collecting and interpreting data. You are almost ready to begin your experiment, but first you must decide how many crickets to test, because individual differences exist from cricket to cricket. You will need to test more than just one or two. You've decided to test 5 crickets at each temperature. Organizing your data. Before you begin your experiment, you should create a table like the one in Figure 10 in which to record your data. Data are the facts, figures, and other evidence gathered through your observation. A data table provides you with an organized way to collect and record your observations. So you can see here that this is how you would collect data. Okay, it's organized and it's a way to explain your data. Graphing your results. After all the data have been collected, you will then need to interpret it. One useful tool that can help you interpret data is a graph. Graphs will be discussed in more detail in Chapter 2. Study the graph in Figure 10 to see how graphing can help you make sense of your data. Graphs can reveal patterns or trends in data. For example, notice that your data points seem to fall in a line. You can see this temperature increases from 15 degrees to 25 degrees C. The chirps per minute also increases. All right, we're going to end the video here at this point. It's been about 15 minutes, and we will continue. I'll make a second video. Get up and stretch, and then I will see you back here in just a few minutes.